Hello! I'm really glad to see you all here today. It's been a pleasure to get to know most of you in conversation, but I know I've missed a few, so I'd like to follow up on that for the rest of the conference. I did want to mention my wife Bethany has just been really faithful in helping, not just helping, but in developing the majority of this material. And I am going to present most of it myself today, but that's more because in the last month or so we've had a couple things that have made it difficult for us to prepare together. But this is intellectual property of Bethany as well. So I think I'm just going to grab a couple things here. We'll get moving. So today we're addressing systematic creativity. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek because I'm aware that most of us in our background, we really love theology. We really love apologetics. And most of us even come from a background where dialectics is like our preferred way of conversation, where there's this form of conversation that we all follow to find truth together. And obviously this is, what would you say? It's plagiarizing systematic theology. So anyway, what I want to be able to address in an overview is that we are like-minded in many ways. I'm going to be reading some scriptures. I'm going to be making some statements about what kind of assumptions I think we probably all hold true. But the majority of what we're going to be getting at is more directly related to how we put these things together. It's very practical. It's something that while Scripture can define our assumptions, we're not going to be putting the Bible verses on a composition necessarily. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. So, what is creativity? I would say creativity is important to recognize is not a talent. It's not something that is endowed to some people and not to other people. It's more like a mode of operating. And this is going to kind of establish a couple of assumptions here. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. I'm jumping around a little bit. The previous verse was John 1 through 4 and 14. That was Genesis 1:27. And then here in Genesis 2:15, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. One thing I want to directly address, and you'll see here in a little bit, is we're made in the image of God, and God is a creator, and de facto, we're creative. Mankind is creative, and there's not any one specific person who's more creative than another inherently, other than they are more regularly in the mode of operating of creativity. They have more regularly exercised that muscle than other people. It's because they are strong in creativity, not because they are inherently more or less creative than another person. And I think that's a really important distinction to be made. We're having issues in our day and age of describing artists as like creatives, that it's a synonym. And I think that a big part of the gospel needs to be us kind of illustrating this is for all people. This is just about being human. And I think that the sooner that, especially we as Christians, realize it's an essential part of our humanity to operate in a creative way, the sooner our art's going to be liberated. So I'm going to dive into a little bit from a book called Art and Physics an excerpt here on imagination and abstraction. So abstract in the sense that language is abstract. Anyway, this will describe it well. So in the case of the visual arts, in addition to illuminating, imitating, and interpreting reality, a few artists create a language of symbols for things for which there are yet to be words. Hold on. These are just my notes, so titles, yeah. The radical innovations of art embody the proverbial stages of new concepts that will eventually change civilization. Whether for an infant or for society on the verge of change, a new way to think about reality begins with the assimilation of unfamiliar images. This collation leads to abstract ideas that only later give rise to descriptive language. For example, observe any infant as it masters its environment. Long before speech occurs, a baby develops an association between the image of a bottle and a feeling of satisfaction. Gradually, the baby accumulates a variety of images of bottles. This is an astounding feat considering that a bottle viewed from different angles changes shape dramatically, from a cylinder to an ellipse to a circle. Synthesizing these images, the child's emerging conceptual faculties invent an abstract image that encompasses the idea of an entire group of objects she or he will henceforth recognize as bottles. This step in abstraction allows the infant to understand the idea of bottleness, so the essence of bottleness, as labeled in a category of our brain which holds thousands of images of bottles. Still, without language, the baby can now signal desire by pointing. Then at a certain moment in that part of the brain called Broca's area, the connections between synapses attain a critical number, tripping the switch that suddenly lights up the power of language. This word factory, noisily chugging away, generates sounds that will replace and even eclipse the earlier images. This is key. As soon as the baby connects the bottle's image with the word bottle, this word begins to blot out the image, so that as adults we are rarely aware of when we engage in abstract thinking. We are not thinking in images. Concepts such as justice, freedom, or economics can be turned over in the mind without ever resorting to mental pictures. While there is never final resolution between word and image, we are a species dependent on the abstractions of language, and, in the main, the word eventually supplants the image. Because the erosion of images by words occurs at an early age, we forget that in order to learn something radically new, we need first to imagine it. Imagine literally means to make an image. Isn't that kind of funny? We're made in the image of God. Anyway. So there's this quote here, "To see is to forget the name of the thing one sees." And I think this is really at the heart of systematic creativity. It's being able to challenge the basic assumption we have about the essence of a thing in a way that can shape our beliefs, shape our values, and in the end, shape worship and culture. So, the next piece I'd like to cover is, it might be good to stop here and just let you know that I'm going to be talking about open mode and closed mode. And open mode is sort of the vast thinking. It's no pressure, it's low stakes, mostly play, allowing your brain to just process information. Closed mode is what needs to happen when you actually need to carry out something. You actually have to be decisive. And this is also at the heart of systematic creativity. It's giving us forms that we can follow. They're closed mode like systems for open mode thinking. And that's because most of us, on a subconscious level, we start to sort of automate a lot of behaviors in our lives. What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning? And like what series of events happens every single day that you never even think about? That's really on a subconscious level. And it's trying to get back to that part of the way that our brain works and addressing that and saying, how do we sort of insurrect this process to try to help ourselves to see things in a new way? So There's a talk that John Cleese, the frontman of Monty Python, gives on creativity that's super valuable. I would encourage all of you to check it out. There are a couple things you might skip, but I've also taken an excerpt here that I think really describes open mode and closed mode very well. Creativity is, for example, absolutely unrelated to IQ, provided that you are intelligent above a certain minimal level, that is. But in investigating scientists, architects, engineers, and writers who were regarded by their peers as most creative were in no way whatsoever different in IQ from their less creative colleagues. So, in what way were they different? The most creative had simply acquired a faculty for getting themselves into a particular mood, a way of operating, which allowed their natural creativity to function. In fact, this particular faculty is best described as an ability to play. Indeed, the most creative, when in this mood, are described as being childlike, for they were able to play with ideas, to explore them, not for any immediate practical purpose, but just for enjoyment, play for its own sake. An example of this is one of Alfred Hitchcock's regular co-writers started kind of describing what the process of working with Hitchcock on a project was like. He says, when we came up against a block and our discussions became very heated and intense, Hitchcock would suddenly stop and tell a story that had nothing to do with the work at hand. At first, I was almost outraged, and then I discovered that he did this intentionally. He mistrusted working under pressure. He would say, we're pressing, we're working too hard. Relax, and it will come. And, of course, it always did. The key here is I think that we're really comfortable working in a very structured way. And we're very opposed to the chaotic vision of the artist, one who walks up to the canvas, throws paint all over it. I know there's a specific example a friend of mine gave, that there's someone who is trying to do a painting study, and he would have this certain mode of kind of getting into the mood that he had to be in order to paint. And as soon as it seemed like he was ready to paint, he would leave and go drench his hair wet and then come back and have to start over. But by the time he was ready to paint, his hair was dry, so he'd have to go back, and it was just this weird sort of... So I use that as an example because I'm familiar with that being something we're generally opposed to. But that's open mode. And I think as a part of a creative process, it's correct for us to be opposed to open mode in and of itself. And it's important for us to have closed mode thinking. But a truly creative person is not someone who only operates in open mode. And they're not either someone who only operates in closed mode. They're somebody who can switch back and forth at the appropriate times when that facility is necessary. So this is a bit redundant, but in other words, to be at our most efficient, we need to be able to switch back and forwards between the two modes, but too often we get stuck in the closed mode. Under pressures which are too familiar to us, we tend to maintain tunnel vision at times when we really need to step back and contemplate the wider views. Skip the page here. Or got them rearranged. So anyway, thanks for your patience. But there we go. Play. This is an excerpt from an article in Newsweek just from June that I think really gets at this interesting connection between our Creator God, us being made in the image of God, and how we create, even on a subconscious level. Scientists studying the brain have discovered that the organ operates on up to 11 different dimensions, creating multiverse-like structures that are a world we had never imagined. By using an advanced mathematical systems, researchers were able to uncover architectural structures that appear when the brain has to process information, before they disintegrate into nothing. Their findings reveal the hugely complicated process involved in the creation of neural structures, potentially helping explain why the brain is so difficult to understand and tying together its structure with its function. In the latest study, researchers honed in on the neural network structures within the brain using algebraic topology, a system used to describe networks with constantly changing spaces and structures. This is the first time this branch of math has been applied to neuroscience. Algebraic topology is like a telescope and a microscope at the same time. It can zoom into networks to find hidden structures, the trees in the forest, and see the empty spaces, the clearings, all at the same time, study author Catherine Hess said in a statement. They discovered that when they presented the tissue with stimulus, groups of neurons form a clique. Each neuron connects to every other neuron in a very specific way to produce a precise geometric object. The more neurons in a clique, the higher the dimensions. In some cases, researchers discovered cliques with up to 11 different dimensions. The appearance of high-dimensional cavities when the brain is processing information means that the neurons in the network react to stimuli in an extremely organized manner. It is as if the brain reacts to the stimulus by building, then raising a tower of multidimensional blocks, starting with rods, then planks, then cubes, and then more complex geometries with 4D, 5D, etc. The progression of activity through the brain resembles the multidimensional sandcastle that materializes out of the sand and then disintegrates. I thought that was especially poignant coming from a researcher on the project. When I look at this is just the visualization of what's going on here. So this is an interpretation of the data that they're getting here. But when I look at this, I see the universe, I see galaxies, I see stars. You know, it's so interesting to me that God's play looks so similar to our brain processing concepts. So who is creative? Well, we already addressed that, but Imagio Dei, which is the phrase that's used in God's image, literally means image, shadow, or likeness. Being made in the image of God, we all communicate like God in many ways. So why are we creative? Because God is creative. We all make things. We are all spiritual, communicative, intelligent, relational, and morally responsible because God is all those things. As we now know, we ought to strive to create and communicate like God does. So we should apply the truths of Scripture to our spiritual, relational, morally responsible lives like Christ has. We must be intentional about what we communicate through our art. Just to address a couple points on play, what's ideal, the ideal play situation is one where the stakes are very low and failure is essentially non-existent. It's play for its own sake. It's also being with playmates who have low to no expectations of you. So when you're really wanting to operate in an open mode with friends or with a senius, something that has to be present is a kind of language that's not kind of imbued with expectation, one that's curious, one that's not judgmental. In fact, the very best thing that you could do in this mode to fight a judgmental mentality is to get curious. It's to start asking questions. In fact, I just wish we did more of this all the time. But especially in the open mode, that's crucial. If you recognize yourself becoming judgmental or sort of disliking an idea and not putting it on par with all the other ideas, you're getting into closed mode. So that should be your signal to kind of back up a couple steps, take a deep breath, and hopefully take a couple points of advice I'll be bringing up later about nice, quick ways to get back into open mode. You kind of caught that humor. Well, I'm already here. So humor's creative purpose, I think, is that it's most likely the fastest method of moving from closed mode to open mode. It's also one of the most successful methods for introducing the relationship of two previously unconnected frames of reference. And I think creativity is almost the exact same thing. So a lot of times humor is like open mode snacks. Creativity is when two frameworks come together to create new meaning. That's at least one definition of it. Well, look, the very last thing well, hold on. That reminds me. So there's this convenience store, and a panda walks into a convenience store. And he's walking down the junk food aisle, and he kind of finds these Twinkies, and he pulls the Twinkie box off the shelf and opens them up and just starts chowing down on these Twinkies. He gets to one box, he pulls out another one. And the store clerk comes up to him and says, "Hey, you can't do that. You have to buy those first." And the panda actually pulls out a gun, and he shoots him, and then he walks out. And the next morning, the newspaper reads, "Panda eats, shoots, and leaves." So just to illustrate two different frameworks that we can reference in a new way, that's an open mode snack for you. So that's a fairly... We laugh eventually at the moment of contact between two frameworks of reference. Now, having an idea, a new idea, is exactly the same thing. It's connecting two hitherto separate ideas in a way that generates new meaning. Now, connecting different ideas isn't difficult. You can connect cheese with motorcycles, or moral courage with light green, or bananas with international cooperation. You can get any computer to make a billion random connections for you, but these new connections or juxtapositions are significant only if they generate new meaning. So as you can play, you can deliberately try inventing these random juxtapositions, and then use your intuition to tell you whether any of them seem to have significance for you. That's the bit the computer can't do. Now, I have a feeling that anytime I bring up the word random, we're going to have a conversation about liberty and licentiousness. Okay, so I'm okay with addressing this. I just want you to be aware that this is a closed mode conversation. We were just moving from an open mode conversation, okay? So England's William Blake was determined to ensure that freedom be extended without limitation everywhere. Committed to the absolute value of freedom, Blake decided to unshackle the vines of his vineyard by instructing that no one was to prune them. They would be left free to grow as they pleased. Blake's principled stand for freedom came at a price. The vineyard overgrew and produced little to nothing in the way of a harvest. Having made an idol of abstract freedom, he learned how little an idol truly profits its maker. The vine simply operated according to the indelible law already graven upon them by their maker. Blake disliked law because it imposes restraints, and restraints often cramp potential. He practiced what he preached. His no pruning rule did, in fact, remove all restraints upon his vineyard's potential, namely, its potential to behave like an out-of-control weed incapable of producing wine. There's a specific detail here in regards to freedom. Again, I think kind of getting at that icon of the chaotic artist, and that is that freedom = licentiousness for them, or at least they wouldn't use that word. Freedom is liberty, So I'm not advocating for that in any way. I do believe that absolute freedom has to come with limitations. I do think God himself limits himself, and God makes limiting assumptions about himself as well as he does about us, and that the more we can learn about what those things are, the freer we will be able to create, even in open mode. That if our basic assumptions / limiting assumptions, because all assumptions are limiting, and there's no way to have assumptions and actually exist, to exist and not have assumptions. That's a universal truth. And that if you want to be as free as possible, if you're really seeking out liberty, then you need to understand the right limiting assumptions to operate from. And that's one of the next pieces I'll be getting into here a little bit with limiting assumptions. There's a couple other things I'd like to address, but I'm already taking more time than I thought I would on this part, so I'll just hop around a little bit. But one thing to try to help you to give you more closed mode systems for open mode thinking is to start recognizing false dichotomies. So one helpful kind of closed mode system is when two things are juxtaposed together, whether they be ideas or visuals or sounds or language, is for one thing, that's kind of a Western pitfall. So in a lot of other cultures, you're not going to really have that problem so much. It's because we're so used to the idea of kind of good and evil. And a lot of times it is true, there's good and evil, but it's not on an equal playing field. It's not a teeter-totter where there is a good here and there's an equal evil here, and it's always that way. For instance, one dichotomy that I believe is false is of love and hate, that it's people choosing two what they would call opposite emotions, and that's what makes it a dichotomy. And I would say that's not true at all, that love and hate are basically the same thing, that if you really truly love anything, you're going to also have to hate many things, and vice versa. And so a real dichotomy would probably be more like passion and apathy. I think that's really also potentially a way for us to liberate creativity. One thing that I know James referenced a couple times that I think is a really healthy conversation for us to have here is possibly the false dichotomy between Christian art and non-Christian art. I'll just leave it at that. And jump into juxtaposition. I feel like juxtaposition is a really helpful tool with identifying these false dichotomies or then setting up other unique comparisons of ideas. They don't necessarily have to be opposites for this to work. So the definition we've used in our design classes for juxtaposition is placing or being placed in nearness or contiguity as part of a substance or a composition. The connection of words is sometimes to be ascertained by juxtaposition. And a really clear example of that is simultaneous contrast, comparing two things next to each other in a way that they describe each other in a unique way. They describe each other's attributes in a unique way that they couldn't do on their own. So in this case, these center squares are the exact same value. But because they're surrounded by these other colors, simultaneous contrast is occurring, and our brain is telling us they're actually not the same value. So I know this is just like kind of a fun optical illusion, but the illustration that I'm trying to make here is if we can teach ourselves to recognize something like simultaneous contrast, we will understand those elements in so much of a deeper way. This is a lot of the work that Joseph Albers did in his work in Interaction of Color, was not just to have fun with these kinds of optical illusions, but to play with them so much that when you saw them in the natural world, it would actually give you a clue about what was really happening in that situation. Anyway, that's just an example for juxtaposition, but that can happen with any kinds of concept. I think I'm ready for the break. Yeah, I like video.
Commercial break. We love this video so much because it seems like the story of a creative to us, or the story of an artist, in the sense that every man and woman is made to be creative in the image of God. So some working definitions: creativity, the act of developing and displaying what is true, good, and beautiful. And that's what's going on when the man's playing the fiddle in the middle of a crowded city. Who is creative? Everybody. Everybody's creative because we're all made in God's image. What is worship? Seeing and celebrating what is true, good, and beautiful. And again, that's what's happening when we display our creativity in front of the world around us. So who is an artist? That question can get a little bit sticky because now we're talking about giftedness, right? And everybody's giftedness is different. So we aren't trying to teach people in systematic creativity that everybody should be a painter or everybody should be a songwriter. But we are saying that we all have a mutual journey that is the journey of an artist in many ways. An artist is someone who worships through creative expression and skillful craft. So the story of an artist starts when you hunger and seek after the captivating beauty that you find around you, when you see God's fingerprints in nature or in other people or in joy of any kind, that you start to hunger for that and you look for it. Proverbs 52 says that out of Zion, perfect in beauty, God shines forth. God is the picture of perfect beauty. And as humans, it's our job to know him better and to seek after him. And sometimes it's a little bit scary even because he's so mysterious. But it's the job of an artist to look at the mystery with both eyes open and to soak it in and to learn more about it using courage. This is what we call worship. It's celebrating and knowing what we see in God and in Christ Jesus. It's a personal journey, and it teaches you to be innovative, and it teaches you to be reborn and molded again and again by who he is. But once you've done that, it's then your job to display that beauty to the people around you and invite other people into that corporate act of worship. When we know the author of beauty, our work is to grow in knowledge and to be remade and reformed. And through art, we can tell our story of reformation and worship in a way that introduces the world to the beauty that we love. Worshipful art is an act of delighting in truth and beauty and inviting others to join in our playful pursuit of him. Now, children are excellent at this. It's really beautiful to watch a child play because they're imagining things that they can't do, things that they've never seen before or heard of before sometimes, but they just try it out anyway. And that's how our relationship with the Lord can be, when we look into his beauty and imagine who he is and who he tells us that he is, that we can reach out and know this thing that we don't know yet. And it takes courage and vulnerability and humility, and that's what I think we call childlike faith. So the girl in this video is expressing that childlike faith before her dad, who's forgotten a little bit what that's like and who thinks that work has to be drudgery, right? But we know that God gives us work that we can enjoy and that we should enjoy in front of the people that watch us. Children give that gift every day. When you ask kids, a group of children, like, who in this room is an artist, you're going to see tons of hands shoot up. And that's what changes as we turn into adults, right? Is we start to think that before we can be an artist, we have to make ourselves perfect and we have to reform ourselves into this image that God can love, basically. But that's not how it works, right? It's only through knowing him that he can mold us into that image. So it has to be the reverse. But if you forget it, then you're going to be in closed mode all the time, and you're going to lose your creative genius that can come through your relationship with God. So it's faith and grace and vulnerability that builds great artists and thought leaders and forward thinkers. Of course, you must couple that with the discipline of craft, which is not where children are the strongest, right? They haven't had time to grow and build their skills. But as artists throughout our lives, each of us should be careful to build good craft into our toolbox, as well as childlike imagination. We can't forget to have that open mode skill that allows us to be thought leaders. And then once we do those things, we can make disciples through our art, and that's what I think the story was about.
So Bethany touched on this really well in terms of worship. I'm just going to skip down to this thing. I know a lot of you are already really trained in worldview, so my hope here is not necessarily to rehash something you already know, but maybe to explain in a new way something that you already know and how you can be more purposeful about this system. I'm just going to define a couple things quickly because I know in our day and age sometimes we use terms and mean different things. And because I feel like this is an important concept, I'm going to read a couple definitions so we're all clear on what I'm talking about when I use some of these words. Belief, a persuasion of the truth or an assent of the mind to the truth of a declaration, proposition, or alleged fact, on the ground of evidence distinct from personal knowledge, founded on internal impressions or arguments and reasons furnished by our own minds. Values, to estimate the worth of, to esteem, to hold in respect that property of a thing which renders it useful or estimable. The real value of a thing is its utility, its power or capacity of procuring or producing good. Culture, it's kind of a fun definition. It's an old one. The act of tilling and preparing the earth for crops, cultivation, the application of labor or other means of improvement, the application of labor or other means to improve good qualities in or growth as the culture of the mind, the culture of virtue. I wanted to use that one not because I'm aware that there are maybe more apt social definitions of culture in our day and age, but the reason I like this one is specifically because it gives you that idea of a seed that it can be cultivated and grows. So this concept, we have these basic limiting assumptions that are usually formed from a very early age by our experiences and later can kind of be countered by truths that we encounter in the world. But on a subconscious level, the best way to continue reforming those assumptions is through experiences again. So creating intentional experiences that help you challenge your assumptions and kind of establish perhaps new assumptions. One example of this I was just talking about earlier today. Someone who mentored me really closely when I was in high school was regularly challenging my basic assumptions about who God was by asking me very difficult questions. And I hated it. It was really, really hard. And it made me so uncomfortable. And it made me feel like I didn't know who God was, even though I thought I knew who he was for 18 years. And I just want you to know that we all need that. We need that for our entire life. And if you think you know who God is and you're comfortable with who he is, you need to start over. You need to start back at your basic assumptions, and you need to learn something new about him that you didn't know before, because he can't be known like that. So anyway, it does go beyond just our knowledge of God, but I feel like that is probably, in terms of my relationship with him, the most valuable thing that I've gotten out of this idea. Assumptions lead into beliefs. You have a basic assumption, it's going to lead into a belief about the way that things are. Beliefs then lead into values, and your values are basically your priorities. They're a list of things that you think are most important. I'll move on. We'll finish the circle first. I think worship, Bethany already gave a great definition. The Webster's definition is to adore, to pay divine honors, to reverence with supreme respect and veneration. Synonyms for worship are love, honor, adoration, devotion, exaltation, reverence, praise, and respect. And really, this is like the bridge between orthodoxy and orthopraxy, I think. It's like you've got all these things that you say are most important to you, and then you've got all these things that you say are most important to you. It's just one is usually happening in your brain, and the other one's usually happening with something you're saying or something that you're doing. And then I think worship is the thing that creates culture. And I know we're kind of all familiar with Rushduni's teachings, and he's fond of the saying that we're all religious beings, and I would believe that. And I think more than that, I think all culture is created out of worship of some kind or another. And I do think it's helpful to define worship more tightly in some circumstances. I know we've done that in the sense of like corporate worship or even specific examples of worship through Scripture. I'm going with the broadest possible definition that I can right now of worship, and that's that everybody values something more than something else, and their actions are worshiping that thing that they value the most. We want God to be that thing, but I think we'll find so many times that he's not. And the culture we're creating with our worship is something we're dissatisfied with. And it's a closed loop here, because our culture, the culture is the experiences we're in the middle of that are forming our basic assumptions about the way that things are. So the way to escape this closed loop, then, I believe, is to go back to the limiting assumptions and say, what does God say? My limiting assumptions ought to be in his word. And what are some experiences that I can create around kind of verifying that truth, basically, helping me to establish beliefs that are correct, that help me put values in the right place. One thing I wanted to point out, and I don't have the graphic for it, I'll just kind of try to draw it with my hands here, is the difference between somebody who is grace-filled and somebody who's legalistic. And I think you can actually kind of represent it in a graphic way here. Somebody who's legalistic is usually going to have a credo around here that's really long. They're going to say, I believe all these things are true. And then that ends up kind of giving you this cornucopia shape, okay? So it's really big up here, and it just kind of spirals in tighter up around culture. If your credo is so long, then by the time you get to worship, your application's really restricted. You're saying the wisdom application is only as good as the beliefs that you have up here. If your beliefs are challenged to the point to where they're nice and concise, usually we're talking about something more universal, and I'll get into this with context. The problem with a credo system that's so long is it's not really allowing for context, and that ends up meaning when you get to context, the physical world, the orthopraxy, your application is stifled. It's really narrow. And so I'm not trying to say you shouldn't believe plenty of things. I'm trying to say there aren't that many universal truths that apply in every context. And that if we keep our belief section open enough, short enough in that sense, it's going to invert that spiral. And our wisdom application when it comes to worship is going to be very broad. And I think that's another thing we can try to keep in mind for sort of liberating that creativity and liberating art in the church and just for Christians on the broader level, is when we're challenging those basic assumptions, kind of what to look out for. So we'll move on from there. Yeah, we're still good on time. So I would say now is a good time to open up another closed mode system for open mode thinking, and that's what we call the concept process. And the concept process can be summed up in these three parts: trite responses, innovation, and new connections. So this can work with music, it can work with writing, poetry, it can work with film. I mean, does everybody have something you write with? I'm going to try an exercise. So this exercise is going to be in associations. I'm going to say a word, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds to write down every other word that you can associate with that word. Ready? Castle. Time. Okay, so who wrote down things? Can you raise your hand for me? Okay, I'm gonna like kind of zigzag through this and then zigzag through that. So can you start for me? Just read off your list. And here's what we're gonna do. Any word that she says that you have to cross off your list. Okay.
I got stone, stronghold, safe, royalty.
Stone, stronghold, safe, royalty. Okay. Did you? Who else wrote down?
I did it in
that?
my head.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Landmark, bulwark, stone, and moat.
Okay. And so everyone who's saying, you'll also need to cross off your list because I'll come back. Okay. And you?
I wrote rock, walls, sword, knife.
Rock, walls, sword, knife. Okay.
House, big, home, queen, page.
House, big, home, queen, page. Okay. Did you have one? Yeah.
Yes, strong, Mansion, fortress, and kingdom.
Strong, mansion, fortress, and kingdom. Okay. Yeah.
I have largeness, grandeur, windows, drawbridge, kings.
Largeness, grandeur, windows, drawbridge, kings. Okay.
I have knight, story, magic, dragon, chivalry, defense, and buttress.
Let's split those into two pieces and I'll repeat them just in case anyone didn't hear. So what was the first half?
Knight, story, magic, dragon.
Knight, story, magic, dragon,
And chivalry, defense, and buttress.
chivalry, defense, and buttress. Okay. Michael?
Did we already say white? Someone say white?
I don't think we got to white.
Okay, I have sky, sand, Transylvania, building, and white.
Sky, sand, Transylvania, building,
Transylvania for mine.
and white. Okay. And back over here.
Scotland, Europe, Palace, War, Japan. But I only got the giant Japan.
Oh, okay. So Scotland, what was the second one?
Europe, Palace, War, and Japan.
Okay.
Europe.
Europe, wall in Japan. Palace.
W-A-R. War.
Okay.
War.
Oh, war. Sorry, war.
That's okay.
Okay. And then did you have any? No. Luke, did you have any?
Cross them out.
Breezy?
Fortification, flag, passage, horse, armor, lord and lady.
Fortification,
Fortification, flag,
flag, passage,
horse, armor, lord and lady.
horse, armor, lord and lady. Okay. And Mallory?
I had damp, tower, rats, princess, shield, plague, alligator.
Okay, nice. Did everybody hear that? Okay. And did you have any?
Yes.
Okay.
Field, peasant, goblet, drapery.
Field, peasant, goblet, drapery. Okay, Matthew?
Hill, mountain, chess, pizza.
You did that on purpose.
It is a little open-minded.
Nice.
Steep, spire, Disney.
Nice. Okay. And anybody else? Yes.
After everything being crossed out, I had Prince, Popper, and Mickey Mouse.
Okay. Prince, Popper, and Mickey Mouse. Mr. Raymond?
I love the chess one. That's the one I thought it's a chess move, castle. Anyways, the only one that I have that what it says, Middle Ages and Maiden.
Middle Ages and Maiden. Okay. Yeah.
Got secure, warm, durable.
Secure, warm, durable.
Town, damsel.
Town and damsel. Okay. Tower. Sorry. Tower and damsel.
Got one other here.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Cold and cement.
Say that again.
Dungeon, cold and cement.
Dungeon, cold, and cement.
Cold and warm.
Yeah. So this is a fairly small focus group. But if you do this in a larger group, by the time you've gotten to the end of everybody, you might only have like 10 or 15 things left. Most of us make really similar connections on the first pass. And that's the illustration of the trite responses. When you put your mind to a problem and you're trying to solve it, usually the first several things you come up with, in fact, when we're doing thumbnail sketches with our design class, the first 50 are off the board. That's an exercise. It's not to say that in everyday life, if you have an idea that's number 12, it doesn't count, because a lot of times our brains are working on those problems days or weeks at a time. But what I do want you to be aware of is that the first idea is usually not the most creative idea. Does that make sense, everybody? On the way down, innovation usually happens after 50. And I feel that at that point, you can start making new connections. And that's when real play can happen. Because otherwise, you're just using a lot of things someone else has already made most of the time. Okay, so we're just going to address a couple things about what's true, beautiful, and good. True, which would be, this again is, I'm kind of speaking generally, but for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. I think it's amazing how much this says about how God communicates and actually tells us something about his standard of truth. And Michael actually had another great verse, which I think was even more descriptive, about the stars, which was in Psalms, that they essentially are the ones who could condemn you just by perceiving them. Obviously, we have a verse like John 14:5, wherein Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me." I have a really fun concept I want to share with you guys, but I think I'm running out a little tight on time. So I'm going to save it for a little bit later. I'm going to put a signpost in this thing about truth, and we'll see if we can come back to it. But I think you get the general idea there. Most of us are probably not confused about what's true. So, beautiful, I would describe as being virtuous. And I'm going to use just a couple verses here. One, 1 Samuel 16:7, which says, "Do not look on his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So what is it then that makes a beautiful heart? A few other scriptures, I think, show us that godly virtues make a beautiful heart. 1 Peter 3:4 says, "Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's sight very precious." Isaiah 52:7 says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." And then Ecclesiastes 3:11 says everything is made beautiful in its time. I know there's a lot more in that. There's more context there. But these verses illustrate that God sees a virtuous heart as beautiful, and that these virtues are only made manifest in our lives through a slow process of sanctification, God as the stone carver, if you will. Webster describes beauty as a particular grace, feature, or adornment, any particular thing which is beautiful and pleasing, as the beauties of nature. I could kind of go on and on there. But the point of this, when it comes to the visual arts, is that what is beautiful still must be the virtue of what is true. So what's beautiful must be the virtue of what is true. In our lives, in the way that we apply Scripture in our lives, and in the way that we compose shapes on a canvas. And that's the fundamental idea behind formalism, which we're going to be getting into here in a little bit. It's a little bit more practical than some of these other pieces. I have a little piece I want to play for you on what is good. We already covered. Oh, this is just a fun piece by Robert Burns. "So beauty armed with virtue bows the soul with a commanding but a sweet control." And actually reminds me, there's a artist statement that I made in my photography courses. I put together I got a refrigerator box, and I made a camera obscura with it, and then I got 12 rolls of film and lined them all up along the image plane wall, and then I got inside the refrigerator box and exposed the image from the inside of the box, and in doing so, my silhouette upside down was exposed on the image with the same thing of what was outside the image. And the artist statement that I put across with that piece is that beauty isn't something to be used. It's not a tool that we hold in our hand and use to shape things. That beauty is something that is meant to shape us, and it's something we need to humble ourselves to partner with God. That's kind of the whole idea behind virtue. So anyway, on to good. What is good? There is a fun piece by Arta Zerdia The drum beats here are provided by Humble Beast. If you haven't heard of them before, this is Beautiful Eulogy. So just try to listen through to what he's saying. But
are you merciful? Why? Because Jesus healed the sick. Because Jesus fed the multitudes. Because Jesus gave legs to the crippled. Because Jesus granted sight to the blind. Because Jesus opened the ears of the deaf. Because Jesus found prostitutes and tax collectors and drew them into the sphere of his love. Because Jesus touched the untouchable and loved the unlovable and forgave the unforgivable and welcomed the undesirable. Because Jesus even now saves the otherwise unsavable. Why? Because they deserve it. When the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, he saved us, not because of works done in righteousness, not because we met him halfway, not because we took the proper steps forward and in good faith have elevated ourselves to the place of the deserving poor, but according to his mercy. We are here because Jesus Christ didn't say with cold indifference, give them what they deserve. They brought it on themselves. Jesus Christ is the mercy of God. And seeing us in our misery and need, he doesn't just feel for us. He takes the necessary action to relieve our distress. He leaves the eternal glory of heaven and the perfect fellowship of the Trinity. He condescends to us, lives among us, suffers like us, dies for us. Do you understand this? Have you experienced this? How then is it possible to experience it and not display it? It isn't possible. You haven't experienced it if you don't display it. The evidence of God's mercy in your life isn't determined by how much theology you know, by how many books you read, but by your active goodness to people in misery and in need. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy.
okay. I don't mean for that to feel quite so heavy-handed, but I think the key here, and I'm speaking, Rusty, you were kind of bringing up a question earlier about like, what do you think our generation is really kind of primed for? And I think, based on some conversations that I've had up to this point, something that a lot of people in my generation are struggling with is we are so thankful for the faithful teaching of people in our lives in regards to what's true and in regards to theology and the right way to think. But we're missing the good. We're missing what is it doing though? What's happening in the world? What's happening in our families and in our culture because of this true thing? And this is another piece of systematic creativity. It just has to be essential to systematic creativity, that you haven't experienced it if you don't display it. And I think that also might be part of the reason why we're so, I would say, harsh when we see a good idea but bad craft. And a big reason why we're turning a lot of people away. Now that's just kind of a small window, because obviously just the application of a piece on canvas it's true for that, but it's also true for what our work is doing in people's lives, what our interaction with people is doing in their lives. And I think that good art has everything to do with application, wisdom application of what's true, and that if you are applying true things in a wise way, that's beautiful. And that's, I think, something that Bethany was getting at, that if you're so concerned with truth that it stifles good, then you have to start back at your limiting assumptions again. Massimo Vignelli, who's a designer, had this quote about appropriateness. So this is my sort of appeal to wisdom application here. Once we search the roots of whatever we have to design, we are also defining the area of possible solutions that are appropriate, specific to that particular problem. Actually, we can say that appropriateness is the search for the specifics of any given problem. To define that prevents us from taking wrong directions or alternative routes that lead to nowhere, or even worse, to wrong solutions. Appropriateness directs us to the right kind of media, the right kind of materials, the right kind of scale, the right kind of expression, color, and texture. Appropriateness transcends any issue of style. There are many ways of solving a problem, many ways of doing, but the relevant thing is that no matter what, the solution must be appropriate. I think that we have to listen to what a thing wants to be rather than contrive it to an arbitrary confinement. And I'm almost done with our first part here, and then we'll take a little break, and we'll dive into formalism. But now that I've given you a taste, I'm going to take a few more minutes to finish this up. Here we go. So this is just an excerpt from C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. This is a type of a creation story alternative. He says, "It was so dark that they couldn't see one another at all, and it made no difference whether you kept your eyes shut or open. Under their feet there was a cool, flat something, which might have been earth, and was certainly not grass or wood. The air was cold and dry, and there was no wind. They all listened. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away. It was hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. Its lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth itself. There were no words. There was hardly even a tune. But it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful, he could hardly bear it. Then two wonders happening at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead, all at once, was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently, one by one, as they do on a summer evening. One moment they had been there, nothing but darkness. Next moment, 1,000,000 points of lights leaped out. Single stars, constellations, and planets, brighter and bigger than any before. There were no clouds. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. If you had seen and heard it, you would have felt it quite certain that it was the stars themselves which were singing, and that it was the first voice, the deep one, which had made them appear and made them sing. The voice on the earth was now louder and more triumphant, but the voices in the sky, after singing loudly with it for a time, began to get fainter, and now something else was happening. Far away and down near the horizon, the sky began to turn gray. A light wind, very fresh, began to stir. The sky, in that one place, grew slowly and steadily paler. You could see shapes of hills standing up dark against it. All the time, the voice went on singing. The eastern sky changed from white to pink, and from pink to gold. The voice rose and rose till all the air was shaking with it, and just as it swelled to the mightiest and most glorious sound it had yet produced, the sun arose. You could imagine that it laughed for joy as it came up, and as its beams shot across the land, the travelers could see the first time what sort of place they were in, for the song had now changed. So that continues for quite some time, and things sprout out of the ground and so on and so forth. But I think this sort of illustration is apt for worship, what God wants from us. And I really think he just wants us to sing along with him. I think that's what dominion looks like. Which brings us to this clip.
Now this has been standing here for centuries. The premier work of man, perhaps, in the whole Western world. And it's without a signature. Chartres. a celebration to God's glory and to the dignity of man. Well, all that's left, most artists seem to feel these days, is man. Naked. Poor, forked radish. There aren't any celebrations. Ours, the scientists keep telling us, is a universe which is disposable. You know, it might be just this one anonymous glory of all things. This rich stone forest, this epic chant, this gaiety, this grand choiring shout of affirmation, which we choose, when all our cities are dust, to stand intact, to mark where we have been, to testify to what we had it in us to accomplish. Our works in stone, in paint, in print, are spared, some of them for a few decades or a millennium or two, but everything must finally fall in war, or wear away into the ultimate and universal ash. The triumphs and the frauds, the treasures and the fakes, a fact of life. We're going to die. Be of good heart. Cry the dead artists out of the living past. Our songs will all be silenced. But what of it? Go on singing. Maybe a man's name doesn't matter all that much.
Okay. Again, I know it feels kind of heavy-handed, but the purpose of that piece is really that I'm trying to illustrate the point that making great art is really more important than being a great artist. I think that's a good place for us to take a quick 5-minute break before the next piece, where we're going to be addressing formalism. Okay, I want to start this piece. Well, I'll wait for, seems like a couple of people there. No, I'm going to go ahead and start because I want to make sure we give everyone else the time they need. I'm going to read from, this is actually another excerpt from the book Art and Physics by Leonard Shlain. You guys should just read it. It's really, really good. He draws a correlation between artists kind of being that baby in the beginning who was able to collect all these things without labeling it, and that a scientist a lot of times comes in after and labels it and puts it in a system of thought. For instance, like with pointillism and the discovery of the atom, or with impressionism and the theory of relativity, and so on and so forth. I think you all really enjoy it. Anyway, what I want to get into here is this interesting connection between the physical world and all these practices that require this imagination, this envisioning something, for them to make a breakthrough or a discovery. In the case of Kepler, this is the excerpt. Kepler instinctively believed in Copernicus's heliocentric theory, but could not explain why it didn't fit Tycho Brahe's, and that's how I've gotten used to saying it anyway, careful observations of planetary positions. After many years of trying alternative explanations, Kepler finally abandoned the dogmatic belief that God would have designed his cosmos using only circular and spherical geometric forms. Like Copernicus before him, Kepler used the artist's technique of perspective. He imagined himself on Mars and tried to reconstruct the Earth's motion from that vantage. This effort consumed 900 pages of calculations. Finally, Kepler figured it out. He wrote his astonishing proposal to a friend and fellow astronomer. The orbits of the planets were ellipses. His friend wrote back that such a proposition was absurd. and Kepler apologized for introducing the inexplicably eccentric ellipse into God's perfect creation. Nonetheless, he wrote of his sight as one more cartload of dung as the price for ridding the system of a vaster amount of dung. Undaunted, Kepler realized that God also respected parabolas and hyperbolas. By immersing himself in the study of the conic sections, which, we were just talking about, like Dichoties, and basically, I probably should have prefaced this. The conic section is this idea that, like, your eye to the corners of a canvas, and then the corners of the canvas to the vanishing point of the image is a matching conic section. And so this kind of math of hyperbolas and parabolas was already established in the art world. And it took Kepler understanding this artistic process to be able to apply it to this scientific discovery. By immersing himself in the study of conic sections, he gained the knowledge to solve the problem. And in an ironic twist of history, the scientist had to refer to books on the subject that had been written by artists. Kepler's insight, known as his 3 laws of planetary motion, exploded upon the world of science like a thunderclap. When his laws were superimposed upon the orbits of the planets, all the complex retrogressions and filigreed epicycles disappeared. What remained were clean, clear, elliptical orbits around the sun for each planet. Anyway, in exultation, Kepler wrote, "I care not whether my works be read now or by posterity. I can afford to wait a century for readers when God himself has waited 6,000 years for an observer. I triumph. I have stolen the golden secret of the Egyptians. I will divulge my sacred fury." It's a very, very good quote. I bring that up because formalism is probably going to make some of you uncomfortable because it looks like too abstract, I think, for a lot of our tastes. It looks too modernistic. And it is. It's a modern approach to kind of deconstructing compositions so that we can understand how to kind of compose them in the best way. What I want you to understand is in the same way that Kepler had to kind of borrow from a different kind of parallel, I think we might need to do that if we want to be able to continue to improve it, even in the sense of, like we've talked about Jackson Pollock. I personally don't have an issue with Jackson Pollock's work. I think that's usually a contextual problem. It's when we try to put him next to Norman Rockwell that we have a problem, because it's totally different work, meant for totally different purposes. And I don't mind his work as a texture study, because I like texture. But I don't think it's meant to carry meaning in the same way, or a story, or something deeper like that. That's something, maybe Rockwell's not the best example. But there is a purpose for this. And I think if you can just do your best to kind of be open with me and give it a try, you might find that it's fun. So, formalism is based on this idea that there are principles of design or principles of art that I'm sure we would probably all agree with. The top tier is balance, order, rhythm, and unity. And so what we're looking for in any piece is how to describe a piece with this vocabulary. So we're saying these are sort of the virtues of critiquing with formalism: balance, order, rhythm, and unity. Balance usually is expressed by contrast, symmetry, or visual weight. Order could be described as visual hierarchy, the use of design elements to direct the viewer's eye through an image. And there's some design language in this because it's pulled from a design class that we've taught, but it's obviously the exact same thing for artists. I.e., Western-minded audiences will generally be directed to view places through like left to right, top to bottom, type in text to draw their eye quickly, contrast, major uppercase letter forms being the simplest way to arrange compositions, like an A shape or an S shape. Triangles and circles are the most directive forms within a composition. That's just like some notes on order. as it relates to composition. Rhythm, which I would kind of pair rhythm, under rhythm, the two tenets are repetition and variation. And that is repetition gives structure and emphasizes order, and then variation builds interest and gives focal emphasis. So the situation here is if you have so much repetition, it's boring. If you have so much variation, it's chaos. It's not understandable and incomprehensible. And then we have unity, which is actually a little bit elusive, but for the most part, the degree of agreement existing among elements in a design is what we're looking for. Those principles can be expressed through these elements and properties with the visual arts. You've got line, shape, space, value, texture, and color. And then like properties of those elements can be framing, layering, transparency, modularity, motion, and dimension. Now, I'm not going to try to get like crazy into this because I'd like to actually pull up some examples, but I do know how much we all like definitions here. So let me pull up my next piece here. What I'm going to try to do is this is a slide deck from one of our design classes, rotational symmetry. And I'm just going to pull up a couple pieces and try to, in a kind of quickly, just show you what I mean. This is Justin Gerard, and he actually did a compositional study for us already, so I'll go ahead and hit on this. Let's see. This was his original piece, his original kind of tight sketch, and he realizes he's got an issue here with the straight forest in the background. It's not serving his composition because what ends up happening is you've got your focal point here, which he establishes more in his finished piece with contrast, and these curvy shapes kind of pull you up and down into this triangle, right? Can you kind of tell that? What you want to happen is to continue directing your viewer's eye through the composition. You don't want to have an out. And in this situation, what's happening is we get all the way down to the warthogs, and then zoop, we're straight out of the composition. And so he's aware that that's a problem. He calls that the triangle of death. And so what all he does is he makes the trees curvier, so it brings you back around to the dwarves, and so on and so forth. You're kind of doing this figure 8 type of a ta-da. That's another one of his pieces. You can really see how much he had to use contrast to draw attention to the Bilbo figure here. Mm-hmm. And even the way the dragon's tail is swirling in this corner is helping bring you back up into the composition so you can't escape through this bottom right corner. But this is a product of formalism. I mean, even just arranging compositions and paying attention to the shapes and how to kind of bounce people up in a different direction or curve them back down to another place. Again, circles and triangles being that most directive form in a composition. That's mostly what we're playing with in these situations. This is just a fun exercise in repetition and variation. So you have repetition of shape and form, variation of value and color. Sorry, I'm just kind of finding the best example here. This is fun. Psychic lines. So there's a lot more going on here than just psychic lines, but it's fun because you have these like triangular hats, and you have these big glowing circles, and you have psychic lines, which is this sort of subconscious thing. When we see someone looking at something, we look at the thing they're looking at. And so that's like a way you can hijack your composition as well. If you actually have people in it, you could just like, my viewer's escaping through the canvas. I'll just like make them look in that place that's going to bring their eye back down. So you just have this continuing piece that's going to bring you around, and you're not going to be able to escape, which is perfect.
Once you go to the top.
I was about to say, what about the top left?
And then you're out.
I think that's why there's so much busyness going on there. It's like, it'd be easier to go through the sky, but by that point, you've hit this circle, right? See what he's doing? Yeah, anyway. Anyway, you can tell I'm repurposing an old slideshow here. The illusion of three-dimensional space. Yeah, okay. So this is one of the things that we try to do to really break down a composition, and it's a form of deconstruction. So we look at a piece, and then we just try to do, you could do something similar with a color study, where you're just blocking out the basic values. You're blocking out the shapes, and then you start to try to understand like where your eye's being directed. So let's say, and these are all students' work. So I'm not trying to tell you it's perfect, but this is someone, an attempt. In the same piece from Justin, you have the sketch where they're just trying to block out the shapes, mostly with like current value or with contrast. And here we have the understanding of like, here's what they think the blocks of color are, the blocks of these different values are, and what they're trying to do is troubleshoot the composition. They're trying to say, okay, if this is correct, which actually there's a couple issues, but let's just say if this is correct, how is it directing my eye right now? And how would I reconstruct this to have a better understanding of the composition and improve it? So the heart of this is to continue improving your work, but if people see drawings like this all over your house, they're going to think you're a weirdo, which is just too bad. Because I think I have a lot of people that think that about the drawings around my house. So anyway. This is a fun piece where, so we're deconstructing here, and then we start reconstructing it into something different. Ta-da! So it's a playful kind of approach, and honestly, there's things about value that are off and everything, but I hope you get the idea. That's kind of the general idea behind formalism. And Bethany, if you would like to come up and...
Should we do some critique, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Would you go back to the original slide for formalism?
Yeah.
Well, no, I just needed to see. Never mind, because we need the pictures.
Okay. You want to tell me which
Why
one?
don't you find one?
Okay.
All right, so balance, order, rhythm, and unity. Balance is basically looking for visual comfort in a piece where, whether through size or through intensity of color or through the motion of the shapes, we have a general balancing out of activity with your eyes movement through the piece. In this piece, can anybody point out balance that you can find? Like, does it feel well balanced, and why?
Sort of got the rule of thirds going. You've got the empty space, a third of the canvas up top, and sort of the middle third has something going on, and the bottom third has a different thing going on. It sort of gets from lighter to darker as it goes down vaguely.
Yeah, we have balance of color and definitely distribution of weight. All of the men are evenly distributed. Let's see. Where would you say the focal point? Like, where does your eye go at the beginning when you first look at the piece? Does anybody have? Yeah.
The standing men.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Standing.
Yeah,
Yeah, so he's out of balance in a way, right? Because he's not leaning on someone else, and most of the people are either lying on or leaning on another thing. So balance is used to establish some repetition in the piece, which gives it meaning. But then they've used variation, and that's what we call rhythm, is proper use of balance and variation, repetition and variation to give us a focal point.
And you can even see the men are spaced at almost an equal distance, where the spaces are similar, but you have a really big gap here, and then the heads are similar until this guy, it kind of breaks the pattern. And so then all of a sudden, so it's kind of this Gestalt idea that it's like all of a sudden the pattern's broken and we look at the thing that's broken the pattern. Yeah.
But you don't really end up looking at the guy with his face turned away because that's not as interesting, and you end up sliding to the guy that's after him.
Yeah, so repetition makes it understandable, but variation adds interest. And it's always going to be that highest point of interest or contrast that ends up being your focal point. So let's try something more abstract now.
This one?
Do we have, I want to push us. I want to push us to something even more.
What about Texas?
Because oftentimes the purpose of a really abstract piece is not to say this is the greatest craft, this is the greatest art in the world, but it is an exercise in practicing seeing deeply, so that you're not even realizing sometimes what it is you're studying or looking at, but you're noticing all of the intricate detail that God builds into every little leaf or every little painting in the sky, basically.
Remember the quote, forgetting the name of the thing you see. That's coming in really handy here.
What are some elements here that establish repetition?
The movement of the lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Diagonal, curvilinear lines, they're sort of following each other.
Mm-hmm.
The gradation feels pretty even.
Yeah. So then we've got variation of tone and color, right? And then we're playing with light a lot. Where is the focal point of this piece? Where would you say it draws your attention?
The brighter top left corner.
Yeah. This red spot here is a high point of contrast between the dark shadow, which is very different from all of the bright colors over here, right? But also red is the weightiest color of all. So anytime you're trying to achieve balance, if you're using lots of colors, the red spot is going to hold a lot more weight than all of the cool colors, and the warm ones hold a little more weight too, but red especially is always a high point of focal. And sometimes it's studying abstract studies like this that can help us figure those things out and get us really comfortable, so that then when we're putting a really complex representational piece together, we have those thoughts in the back of our head, like, ooh, I should put this guy in red, because in the big picture, in the big scheme of thing, that's going to give him more weight.
Was that actually not like sandstone? Was that not a study of sandstone?
No, that was a picture. Yeah, it just
Oh,
was
okay,
abstract
gotcha.
enough, I thought. And that's exactly what I could imagine the artist doing in this situation, having all the men in a row and realizing, my eye's not being drawn to the guy I want to look at. So let's just have the guy dug down enough that we're missing a head in the pattern, and
Could we do the positive and negative space? It'd probably be our last one.
Which one?
You just skipped one that was the two faces. Yeah, we haven't talked about space very much, but in this picture, the dark is what you would call positive space, and the light is what you would call negative space. But it's playing with the idea, right? Because what ones of you see when you look at it at first might be different, and there's two shapes going on. Yeah, so we've got space, and we've got line being used, and high contrast. Where's the focal point in this piece?
Negative space.
Yeah, I think it's right here in the middle, because the two noses are like pointing together. But then the lines have a lot of repetition, and it's just a very like calming and simple piece, but there's actually a lot to be had.
That's good.
The negative space.
Yeah. So I think we've about reached our limit.
Yeah. Do we? Where are we on time? Because
I stopped it at the break, so that's your time.
Okay. We have like a minute and a half. So I did want to address concept, craft, and context. And I'm sorry we have so little time to address it. But one of the examples that we use, and this is one of the most helpful, or at least has been thus far for me, the most helpful tools in critiquing pieces, generating your own pieces, is first identifying an appropriate concept, second, identifying good craft, and third, identifying appropriate context. Really, if you have two and not the third, you're in trouble. It has to be this nice trinity for any piece to be very successful. So if, let's say, you have a painting, the craft is excellent, and it's of a toilet, and this painting is hanging in an art gallery, what's the problem? It's probably like concept and context are our issue. What if this painting of the toilet is hanging in a toilet store? All of a sudden, context has changed, and maybe we're on the right track here. Now, I know we maybe like all have different ideas about classical art and what's appropriate and what's not. But there, for instance, there are some nude sculptures, which I would say like that's inappropriate. That shouldn't be in a public venue for anybody just to be walking around and being exposed to. What's the issue there? Again, I think it's context. It's like the concepts, there's nothing wrong with this concept. The craft is like excellent a lot of times, but it's not my bedroom at home. And so we've got an issue with context again. In fact, I would say a lot of times the issue, craft is so easy to tell if craft is the issue. A lot of times we end up playing with concept and context. So that is the end. And I'd love to explore some more of these ideas with you again over the next day and a half or so. Hopefully you've got some takeaways here on what kind of closed mode systems can help you to exercise open mode thinking. So thanks for your time.